Well, good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Vincent Bacon. I'm the director of the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics. I'm very excited about the event that we have tonight. We are doing it in partnership with the School of Biblical and Theological Studies, and we are partnering with the Mark Knoll Lecture tonight. We're very glad to have the namesake of the lecture here with us. That's going to be I've learned over the years that sometimes people are like, why did you point me out like that? But hopefully that was all right. But I'm very glad that we're able to join together in having Dr. David Daniels here with us tonight. A couple of years ago, I saw a video of Dr. Daniels talking about Africans and the Reformation, and my antenna immediately went up. Because I remember thinking, well, this isn't usually what people are talking about when it comes to the Reformation. And he didn't seem to be going way out on some limb with what he was doing. He was really directing our attention to places we hadn't looked. So I thought, all right, at some point, I've got to get him on campus. And so now today is that day, and I'm very glad that he is here to lecture to us about African Christians and the Reformation. So, Dr. Daniels is the Henry Winters Lewis Professor of World Christianity at McCormick Theological Seminary. He joined the faculty in 1987, and he's been Professor Extraordinarius at the Institute for Gender Studies at the University of South Africa. He's published on topics related to Black Church, global Pentecostalism, and African Christians in the 16th century Europe. And he has been and does participate in many funded research projects throughout the world, really, not just in the United States, and is serving on various boards. And he's also known as an expert on world Christianity. So I'm very excited that he's here with us. I look forward to the conversation we're going to have with him tonight. So, without further ado, Dr. Daniels.
I want to thank Dr. Nicole for the invitation. Also, people have asked me, is this your first time to the campus? And I had to say, oh no, I came from Mark's events with the Institute, I think, to study American evangelicalism and the late Edith Blumhofer. So I've been on the campus. But I told people I only came to wherever they told us to go. I never wandered around. So it's good seeing Mark, and good. Thanks for the invitation. Good meeting Jennifer. I'll dive right in. So as has been mentioned, my area is world Christianity. And so I'm trying to figure out how to make the Reformation a topic within world Christianity. And the part of world Christianity I'm more interested in is on what are the influences from the global south on the global north. So the questions could be, how did Christianity in the global south interact with Christianity in the global north? But it can also be, how did African Christianity influence Christianity in Europe? Now, I've been warned when I use this word influence that, am I talking about causation? Is there a factor that's there? So I should really have that in quotation marks. Just on demographics, within the 16th century, there are about 100,000 African Christians who lived in Europe. The majority of them lived in Portugal. Lisbon had about 100,000 residents. 10,000 were people of African descent. But there are also Africans in Seville, in Rome, where we're the focus of our talk tonight, Venice, London. Matter of fact, the first large group of people of African descent who were Protestant are in London during the 1590s. There's probably about 100 or so Protestants are there. And we find their names by looking at the parish records. And you do know there's a fire in London around that time, so there could even be a little larger because of the records that are lost. And then on the island of Cyprus, which is part of the Phoenician Republic at this time, up until about 1570, there's some some Ethiopian Christians who are in Nicosia. This is a visual way of knowing what Lisbon looked like on a major thoroughfare in the 1570s to 1580s. This is the New Market Street. And just for a close-up, these are the kinds of people you would see on that street in Lisbon in 1570, 1580s. There's some Europeans from other parts of Europe who go to Lisbon and said, this is not Europe anymore, we're in Africa now. So one of the things I want to do with this picture is for us to not think of Europe as being all white, or thinking of Europe as if there are Africans there, that they're all slaves. But to realize there's a variety of diversities there, and that our mental images need to adjust to the Europe of the time. I also want to argue that while slavery is horrific and was horrific, slavery does not exhaust the experience of Africans, Christians in Europe in the 16th century. That there's other things going on. Everyone is not enslaved. Even some that are formally enslaved, emancipated, they're able to become teachers and carpenters and other kind of occupations that were beyond. African Christians during the Reformation, they're coming from places like Ethiopia, which will be my focus tonight, the Congo, Angola, Sao Tome, the island off of where Angola is, Cape Verde, the Senegambia region, and probably a disproportionate number of the people who are in Europe at that time are enslaved. But there's a percentage that are not. And so there are nobles from both Congo as well as some other parts of Africa that send their young noble adults to Europe, specifically to Portugal for education. They go there to go to university. So regarding the Reformation, though, the Africans most engaged with the Reformation were Ethiopian Christians, if we're defining engagement narrowly. My colleague, Matteo Salvadori, who's a scholar within Ethiopian studies, identified this picture. And so the person in red is Pope Paul III. He's the Pope during the 1540s. But right behind him, you see Tessa Seyon. Not only then do we have his writings about him, but now we have his picture. And this picture was taken around 1540. The part of the picture you don't see is that Ignatius of Loyola is being confirmed by the Pope. But I wanted you to see him as an up close. And so Seyon not only talks to the Pope, but he also is an advisor for Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius supposedly was only interested in going to Asia. Tessa Seyon convinced him to think of adding Ethiopia to that. So these conversations I'm describing are not periphery, but they're involved with the major players of the time. So the question then, this time I have it in quotation marks. How was the 16th century Reformation shaped, in quotation marks, by Ethiopian Christians and their Christianity? As I mentioned, I see myself as a person involved with world Christianity, and therefore in making Ethiopian Christians and Christianity topics in this discipline of Reformation studies, I must do some things. And I've already mentioned to Dr. McNutt that afterwards she can tell me where I missed the mark and what I need to do to raise the bar. So these are the 5 questions that I've been wrestling with, hoping that if I can answer them adequately, it will convince Reformation scholars that there is a topic here. The first, is my task then to identify specific Ethiopian Christians who played a role in the Reformation, as well as identify the roles they played? If I do that, have I proven something? 2, is it to identify how Ethiopian Christianity was a theological topic during the Reformation? If we can show it was a topic, does that mean that it is an issue that's there? 3, is it to identify Reformation era debates that centered around Ethiopian Christianity? Does that then raise the bar? 4, is it to identify whether and how Ethiopian Christianity served as the bases for arguments that supported Catholic and Protestant positions during the Reformation? And then lastly, is it to identify whether and how Ethiopian Christians or their Christianity influenced, in the quotation marks again, the direction of Protestantism or Catholicism during the Reformation. So I'm hoping these are the right questions. I gave a similar presentation at the University of Frankfurt earlier in January. And again, I asked them the same thing. If these are the right questions, if not, what are other questions? Because maybe with better questions, I might still be able to go back to the material and come up with answers. I'm not out here alone. There are others that have been engaging Ethiopian Christianity in Europe in the 16th century. However, they often are doing it either as scholars of the modern period, or they're doing it as Ethiopianists, studying Ethiopian. I'm not sure I can count how many people are focusing on Ethiopian Christianity and tying it to the Reformation. Of course, I do that. I teach at a seminary. I teach the history of Christianity. I see myself part of world Christianity. So to only talk about it in terms of modern era doesn't cut the issue of how they might intersect with Martin Luther or Thomas More, or intersect with Theodore Beza. But scholars who are not part of world Christianity, but who are focusing on 16th century Catholicism and Ethiopian Christianity, are people from the mid part of the 20th century like Enrique Cerulli, current people like Samantha Kelly at Rutgers, Matteo Salvadori, Verena Boll, Sam Kinnerly, Verena Crepes, Andre Martinez da Luz Monet, and James Durenzi. And these are almost all of them, but I'm not meaning to do an exhaustive list. And then people who are working on the Protestant side. Now, I should warn you ahead of time. To be included on this list, all you need to do is mention Ethiopian Christianity. So I want to tell you, this list is shorter if you have to write more than 2 paragraphs. And if you're looking for a book, nobody's on the list. If you're looking for some chapters, I'm on it. Stanislav Palau's on it. But Martin Brecht, the famous Luther scholar, in his 3-volume work on Luther, actually has a paragraph dealing with Martin Luther and the Ethiopian cleric. George Poste was an Hungarian theologian. Thomas Hart was a Swedish Lutheran scholar. Martin Wittenberg. And then Stanislav Palau has actually written a whole chapter dealing with Martin Luther and the Ethiopian cleric. Jennifer McNutt has focused on Theodore Beza, engagement with Ethiopian Christianity, and then I have focused on Luther, as well as focused on how we look at this Catholic side. So did Ethiopian Christians play a role in the Reformation? If so, what roles did they play? So this is not an exhaustive list, but there were, serving in Europe, some Ethiopian Orthodox priests and monks. A group of them are in Rome. The Pope, a Pope in the late 1400s, actually allows them to use St. Stephen's Chapel, which is literally right next to St. Peter's Basilica. So they're not hidden somewhere in an off section of Rome. They're right there in Vatican City, literally right next to St. Peter's Basilica. There's a hostel that's there. Some people say that there's a school, there's a library. At some point, some people think there's a college, all related to Ethiopian Christianity. But other Orthodox people could use that as a place to stay too. There's some Ethiopians who become Roman Catholic priests. There's an Ethiopian Orthodox who joined the Catholic Church and was consecrated a bishop sometime in the 1550s. He had served he served as the papal nuncio to the whole Orthodox communion. There were Ethiopian who were scholars, some who were theologians, and then 2 famous ones, co-editors, maybe even just the editor, one of the Ethiopic Psalter and the other of the Ethiopian New Testament, published it in CACE, and then some are abbots and some are authors. So they're present, their roles, they're interacting, as I mentioned, with like Pope Paul III, they're interacting with Martin Luther, they're interacting with Ignatius of Loyola, and so therefore they're not on the edge of the Reformation. They're actually involved with the major leaders of the Reformation. Not all of them, some of them. Samuel Tomas Walda is the person who helps a German theologian, Johannes Potkin, who is seeking to have the Bible in CACE, the Bible in Ethiopic language, printed in Europe. And obviously, Potkin doesn't know CACE, so therefore Samuel has to teach him. And within the introduction, Samuel has a part where he introduces himself and describes what he sees as part of the project. Saga Zaab is a theologian who's in Lisbon, but unfortunately, Lisbon is the first Catholic place to sour on the Ethiopians. And they do that around 1530, during the 30s. And he happens to arrive in Portugal right at that time. So he's basically under house arrest during this whole time. Abba Michael, or the person I call Michael the Deacon, unfortunately, we only know what Luther tells us about him. There's some speculation, and it's wild speculation, that he's related to the Ethiopian who converts to Catholicism, Johannes, and that they're actually from the same family in Cyprus. But again, it's all speculation. Tassisayan, you saw his picture earlier. He's operating during the time of Trent, and he is the editor of the Ethiopic or CACE New Testament. They call it Ethiopic New Testament, as well as baptismal rite and a mass. And then there's 50 to 100 other Ethiopian Christians in Rome off and on throughout the 16th century. And this is at a height, so I don't mean total. There's certain times there's 50, there's certain times there's 100, depending on the year. And then Johannes, that I mentioned before, is part of the papal staff, has influence with a number of cardinals and popes, and he's the one that gets consecrated as a Roman Catholic priest first, then a bishop, and then he becomes the papal nuncio to the Orthodox world. He's consecrated as a Roman Catholic bishop to the Orthodox community on Cyprus. It's interesting. I didn't have time to churn the pictures, so I apologize. But if you can see on the first one, the Psalter is first published. Then around 1518, there's the Polyglot, where you have the Bible in 4 translations. And this Bible, you can see, is in Hebrew, Greek, CACE, or Chaldean, as they called it, and Latin. So this gives you an opportunity that even if you can't read CACE, if you can read Latin or if you can read Hebrew, you can begin to figure out what might be being said. You begin the process of learning that's there. And the first book printed in Europe that was not printed in a European language or written in a European language, nor Hebrew, is in CACE. Here's the printing of the New Testament, 1545 to 1549. As I said, Tassisayan is the editor. If you can see here that part of it tells you his name, Petros Egyptos, but then it also tells you that this is dedicated to Paul III, who's the Pope, the Pontiff Maximilian, and then Claudio, who is the Emperor of Ethiopia. So this is probably the first text printed in Europe that is sort of dedicated to a Pope and an Emperor. The Pope being Roman Catholic Pope and the Emperor being Ethiopian. In the preface to the baptismal rite, this picks up some of the tensions, as I mentioned, that some of the Catholics, first in Portugal, then within Rome, to sour on the Catholics and see them as schismatics and heterodox. So this is Tassisayan speaking for himself, publishing it in the preface to Paul III. Ethiopians are and want to be Catholics and are judged to be schismatic by almost all Europeans, except us as sons of the church. And then the critical Europeans know through you that none of us shrink back from the Roman church, but rather that we embrace and revere it as the mother of all churches. So again, he's trying to deal with the Catholic tension. But what I want you to pick up is that the African is speaking for himself, but the Ethiopian is speaking for himself. And he is speaking to the Pope, telling the Pope that you can straighten this out if you will just allow them to realize that as you know that I'm committed to the church, that Ethiopia is also committed to the church. European interlocutors, I already mentioned Johannes Potkin, Erasmus, who's a a colleague, Damayal Gois, who writes about Ethiopian Christianity. They talk about Christianity in Ethiopia. I already mentioned Pope Paul III, and you saw his picture. One of the persons who works with the Vatican team is Cardinal Marcello Cervini, who's part of not only the papal staff, but works with the Council of Trent. And then on the Protestant side, Martin Luther, again, the letter that Melanchthon wrote, that Martin Luther signed, is part of your handout. Melanchthon also sends out the letter under his own signature, same letter, identical. Martin Bucer, and then, as I mentioned earlier, Theodore Beza. Again, in your handout, this is part of the letter from Cardinal Marcello Cervini to Paul III's secretary. This is after the Council of Trent, recall, starts in 1545. I'd like you to have the Indian. It's unclear whether India is what we call India or India is where Ethiopia is, but he's speaking of Ethiopia. I would like you to have the Indian and Maronite masses translated to see if those provinces, converted by different apostles, have the same substance we have in terms of sacrifice, the intercession of saints, and the prayers of the dead. If I remember correctly from Brother Peter, that's Tessa Sayon, told me that they, Ethiopians, have in the Mass all these things. When we deal with these matters, meaning at the Council of Trent, it will be better to be informed. So one of the big questions was, as Cervini said, how does one look at Ethiopian Christianity? It is in this time period that people begin to say Ethiopian Christianity doesn't begin in Acts chapter 8. It actually begins in the 4th century. However, Cervini, a cardinal, educated, scholarly, either doesn't agree with that or doesn't believe that. So he's part of the group that says that not only was the Ethiopians converted by the apostles, but they actually arise prior to the Greek church. Because they're Acts chapter 8, not Acts chapter 10. And not only is Acts chapter 10 just Gentiles, not necessarily the beginning of the Greek church. The second thing is that there is this idea, as he said, that within their traditions, they have been unaltered since the 1st century. So as I mentioned before, if we could find then that they have the prayers for the dead, the intercession of the saints, if they have the sacrifice in their Mass that goes back to the 1st century, or around that time period, that gives us historical credence for what we've been arguing theologically. Then the Ethiopians say that they have 80 canons connected to Nicaea. The Greeks and the Romans say they have 20. So the Greeks and Romans lost 60 of the canons. So Cervini knows that this could be mistaken, but he wants to investigate to find out whether there are canons that got lost within the Greek church and the Roman church. And then, as I mentioned, there's the primacy of the Pope and other things found within Ethiopian Christianity. But other topics is around the issue of the vernacular Bible. So on the Catholic side, during the 3rd session of Trent, the one in early 1560s, they're debating whether all vernacular Bibles need to be banned by the Catholic Church. And Cardinal Arce from Spain says we can't do that because the Ethiopians, and they list some others, their Bibles are historic ancient Bibles. And if we do that, then we're not respecting the history of the tradition. And so they actually end up saying that we will prohibit Catholics from using vernacular Bibles at this time. But we will not outright prohibit vernacular Bibles because the Ethiopian Bible and others like that need to be respected. So they're willing to acknowledge it. Then, debates about the primacy of quotas we already talked about. Issues around new Christians have come up because of the fact that the Ethiopians celebrate 2 Sabbaths, Saturday and Sunday. They don't eat pork, and they practice circumcision. Perfect way for former Jew or former Muslim to hide and say, I'm Christian, like the Ethiopians. And so they wrestle with that. And then, of course, on the Catholic side, they come out and say that that is heterodox. The Ethiopians say the reason why they do it is that they're following Jesus. They say if you look at Acts chapter 15, that's what those who followed Jesus the closely did. The exception was just made for the Gentiles. Debates about married clergy. We saw earlier from Savini questions about the Mass, purgatory, and then questions about the Trinity. Stanislav Palau argues that Luther was able to use the Ethiopians as a defense against the so-called anti-Trinitarians. Because of the fact, again, if they go back to the first century, if these are Christians that come out of Acts chapter 8, even though we don't see the word Trinity in the Bible, we have Christians that have practiced this from that first century, and therefore they serve as historical precedents. So again, Ethiopian Christianity is employed in arguments on the Catholic and Protestant side, obviously going in different directions. On the Catholic side, the CACE Bible is of value. Dietary laws ends up being an issue. Savini and some others are wondering whether Ethiopian Christianity could be a third way to resolve the conflict between Catholics and Protestants. And then again, as you saw from Savini, about the liturgy. On the Protestant side, now what's curious is they're both talking about the same tradition, but they're reading it differently. So the Protestants say the Roman Catholic Pope is not recognized by the Ethiopians. He's only one patriarch among many. They are the example of a vernacular Bible and gays. They have a married clergy. They have communion in bread and wine, both kinds, and they don't have purgatory indulgences. Now remember, Savini wanted to find out if they do. It hadn't been proven yet. And there's a question about whether Tessa Sion is trying to find a way of ingratiating himself. And so he overstates what Ethiopian Christianity is about. But actually, it really doesn't matter for me as an historian. Because remember, my question was it a topic of the Reformation? The CACE Bible, or Ethiopic Bible, was originally called Chaldean. Samantha Kelly notes that some people thought that Chaldean was the first human language, the language that Adam spoke and Eve. And so therefore, the CACE Bible is in the original human language. Others thought it was the language of Abraham, because remember, he comes from Chaldea and Sarah. For Catholic reformers, it was a key in the comparative study between the Vulgate and this, because again, they're seeing it as an early text. They also thought that it could attest to the veracity of the Vulgate translation. And then again, as some of you might know, the Ethiopians have about 81 books that's part of the Bible. So, in some of those books that the Catholics don't have, and that clearly the Protestants don't have, is purgatory confirmed, or indulgences, or anything like that. So they're opening up to find other things besides biblical proof. Other things like biblical proof, but again, beyond the canon. And then, as I mentioned on the Protestant side, is that this is vernacular that goes back again, some things to the early centuries of the church. Now, let's switch to Martin Luther, and again, I gave you the letter from Martin Luther. And again, as I said, the letter was drafted by Melanchthon, but signed by Luther. So before we get to the letter, I was struck by this quote when I found it. Within the Song of Solomon's, published, the commentary lectures published 1530-31, means after Luther is clearly Protestant. But he also says the same thing in the first Psalms lectures in 1513 to 1515. So he holds on to the same idea over 15 years later. But the church is symbolized and called by the name Ethiopia. I mentioned in a discussion at class with Dr. Larson earlier today that Luther has another quote where he says, "Those who are closest to the S-U-N are closest to the S-O-N." And then he says the Southern Christians, he actually calls them Southern Christians, meaning Ethiopians, are closer to Christ than European Christians. So he has, and again, partly he's trying to, one thing, it could be used as a polemic against the church in Europe, which would be a polemic against the Roman Catholic Church. So now, this is only part of the letter. There was with us in Germany the Reverend Michael, the Ethiopian, a deacon. Conversing privately with him concerning Christian doctrine, we have heard that he properly agrees with the symbol, meaning the creed, with the Western Church holds, and that he does not think differently about the Trinity than what the Western Church thinks. Therefore, we commend him. And there's this whole debate about what does it mean that we commend him. For although the Eastern Church has several dissimilar ceremonies, he, again, Michael the deacon, judges that their dissimilarity does not nullify the unity of the church and does not mitigate against the faith, since the kingdom of Christ is the spiritual righteousness of the heart, the fear of God, and the confidence in Christ. We, Luther and Melanchthon, also think this opinion is right. We have also learned from him that the rite which we observe in the use of the administration of the Lord's Supper and the Masses agrees with the Eastern Church. Now, we can get to a debate about whether Luther actually understood Michael the deacon or whether Michael the deacon actually explained. But I'm an historian. I'm not trying to analyze Luther's theology. As an historian, remember my question was, is this a topic in the Reformation? And this clearly is a topic for Luther. But even better, Luther is saying that Michael the deacon has convinced him of some things. That, as you know, Luther can be very cantankerous and hard to come along with. Compromise is not in the vocabulary. And so Luther doesn't even want communion with Zwingli. And they never do. Until after Luther dies, centuries. Maybe not centuries. But the point is, he's coming to agree with this Michael the deacon. And not as an individual, but as representing the Ethiopian church. And he ends up talking about this visit in 1534. And like 3 or 4 times over the next 4 years, that shows up in the table talks. So he hasn't lost this event. This is an event that's not a one-off. He's willing to come back to it at least 3 or 4 times again in those years. So in red, I want to look at that we also think his opinion is right. This is hard. Around 1700 or so is when modern racism begins. How many theologians do you know from Europe will tell you that they agree with an African's interpretation or an Ethiopian's interpretation of Christianity? That they even know it, and that they've been convinced by it, and that they even heard it, and that they actually learned something from an Ethiopian Christian in the 18th century, 19th century, or even early 20th century, and that they're actually even willing to quote him or her and give them credit for their thought. There's George Postfay that I mentioned to you before, the Hungarian 20th century Lutheran theologian. I'll tell you that when I mention this to some Luther scholars, Melanchthon scholars, they think Postfay is wrong. Again, I'm a world Christianity scholar. I'm not at this point wanting to say whether Postfay is right or wrong. I just think it's up for debate. So listen to Postfay. The Luther and Melanchthon were anxious to talk to this man, Deacon Michael, to get information about the doctrines which were held as Christian truths in his home church. As a result of his colloquium, he's maybe putting in the same status as colloquy of Marburg and others. Luther could say that his conception of the Oriental churches was confirmed by the statements of Deacon Michael. Of course, the cardinal question for Luther was the inquiry whether the gospel of Christ was the center of the teaching and the life of the church of Ethiopia. He knew already from previous studies that this community did not accept the authority of the Pope. But after his talk with his guest from Africa, another thesis of his historical studies received an illustration. So not only Luther interested in biblical arguments, theological arguments, but according to George Postfay and a few others, he's interested in historical arguments. He could now say that the most of the deficiencies of the church in the West were related to her subordination of the papacy. By contrast, in the East, where the papacy had no power, these deficiencies were missing. With great satisfaction, Luther recorded the information that among the Christians in Ethiopia, their order of service generally corresponded to the evangelical congregations of Germany. Their acceptance of the ancient Christian creeds, as well as their understanding of the main articles of the Christian faith in harmony with the gospel, were also important signs for Luther that the Christians of Ethiopia were true members of the church Ecclesia Universalis. So what that means, and I think Postfo is the only one that is arguing this, that this letter is really a letter of Eucharistic fellowship. Luther refuses to have Eucharistic fellowship with Zwingli. Clearly not with the Anabaptists. In July 1534, he's not even ready to have it with Bucer, but he will a little bit later. But he's willing to with the church in Ethiopia, if it's to be read that way. Now, other people who do read this, including Martin Brecht and others, they think this is a letter of recommendation. But what Luther often only writes, letter of recommendations, for people who he's nominating or recommending for a parish, for a church as a pastor, or someone for a student for the university, or a pastoral letter. I'm not a Luther scholar, but I haven't, in my conversation, no one has said that there's any other letter like this. So maybe it is just a letter of recommendation, but maybe it's not. But the key part for a scholar of world Christianity is now we're up for a debate. So on the Protestant side, communion of both kinds I've already mentioned, the vernacular scriptures, the married clergy, and then what they reject, the Roman papacy, the indulgences, purgatory, and marriage as a sacrament. So when Eck and others tell Luther, you're making this up, Luther can say there's historical precedent in a church that goes back to the 1st century. But even if you change it, it goes back to the 4th century. So, Ethiopian Christian influence on the Reformation, that's the question. I hope you can see that Ethiopia was a positive topic in various Catholic and Protestant circles, along with the potential maybe, which I didn't unpack as strong as I could have, of a possible third way for a few reformers in addition to Cervini. So I make what I call my bold claims. So bold claim number 1. Even with our cursory look in less than 35 minutes, I hope you can see that Ethiopian Christians did play a role in the Catholic and Protestant Reformations. I hope you can see, even again with this very short cursory look, that Ethiopian Christianity was a debated topic among Catholics and Protestants during the Reformation. I hope you can also see that Ethiopian Christianity was the basis for arguments, potentially supporting Catholic and Protestant positions at the different junctures during the Reformation. Even if the Catholic Church sours on Ethiopian Christianity, considers it heterodox by the 1540s, Cervini is already showing that they're still willing to appeal to it, to find proof, to bring to the Council of Trent to argue against Protestants. And then lastly, this is the far-out claim that Ethiopian Christianity influenced Catholicism and Protestantism during the Reformation. So therefore, Ethiopian Christians and Christianity should be topics when we talk about the Reformation. And if we ever see a survey on the Reformation, there should at least be a mention in one sentence. Thank you.
Questions for Dr. Daniels?
Or reactions, or...
Yes. Questions, reactions.
Yes, sir.
Since both Protestants and Catholics could draw on the Ethiopian tradition, did either side recognize that using Ethiopian Christianity was a double-edged sword? I mean, they both can appeal to it. Were they aware that the other side could be using elements of it, drawing the uniqueness of that tradition?
Yeah. As far as I know, the answer is no. What I do know is that, or what it looks like, is that after Trent, it looks like you see less and less references to Ethiopian Christianity as an arbiter. But on the Lutheran side, at least, and this is what Stanislav Bilal has shown, you can see the argument going all the way up until 1680s, 1690s. So even 140 years after Luther's dead, they're still talking about Ethiopian Christianity as being something that's attractive. But your question is a good question. The hard part is that, as I mentioned before, there's a set of scholars that are focused on Catholic archives. And then three of us, that are focused on Protestant archives. And no one has been in conversation to compare that's there. And so it could be that that's realized. But yeah.
Thank you so much, David. What a pleasure to hear you lay this all out. And of course, I am in agreement with you on this topic.
Can I write that
down? Just two things. One, an observation. I think that one of the problems that Reformation studies has often faced is that it has sometimes cut out parts that are relevant to its story, in part because things like the category Reformation sometimes only denotes only denotes Protestantism rather than Catholicism. And one thing I've noticed is the Spanish Reformation, which is a very interesting, complex, integral story, is often left out. And I really hear you saying that when you were laying all this out, like, look at Spain, and I think that's part of the problem, is that Reformation scholars haven't been looking at Spain and need to be doing that. So just an affirmation and an observation. The other thing I think you laid out so well was, what are Protestants gaining from thinking about Ethiopia, and as they are really stuck in this polemical debate, and Catholicism as well. What do you think what does Ethiopia want to get out of Catholicism and Protestantism on the other side? And I don't even know if we know that yet. But
No, there is some elements of that. So first of all, it's unclear of whether. Well, first, so outside of Europe, there's a group of Ethiopians in Jerusalem who are aware of what's going on in different places, and then there's those in Ethiopia. It doesn't look like that those in Ethiopia are at all curious or interested in what's going on with Protestants.
Okay.
So that's why this Michael Deacon possibly is from Cyprus.
Okay. Interesting.
But a couple of things. First thing is the Ethiopians, as we now call them, were shocked that the Europeans would call them Ethiopians. They are Abyssinians, coming out of the word Abyssinia. So they didn't even identify as being this term Ethiopia. Second is that there's this, and a lot of people talk about this whole myth of this Prester John, this very holy, pious Ethiopian king. They didn't even know who Prester John was, but if you call us Prester John, so I guess that's his name. So part of it is that they are seeking to be in conversation. Now, as you know, the big issue is that the Ethiopian church is on the other side of the Muslim divide. And so the only church they can get to without having to go through Muslim trade routes is the churches in South India, the St. Thomas Christians. And there is some interchange there. And so they're excited about the fact of connecting with their Christian sisters and brothers in Europe because they saw themselves as one united church. And so I think that's the first thing they want to get out of it. The second is there are people on both the European side and Ethiopian side that thought that they needed to protect each other from Muslim advancements. And of course, as those who know the particular story, Ethiopia is overtaken by Muslim forces, and it is the Portuguese that helps rescue them in addition to the Ethiopians fighting. So actually, that desire to have relationship came to their survival. Lastly, I think the monks in Jerusalem, as you know, Jerusalem is a multi-confessional communion. There are Christians there from Georgia, Christians there from Greece, Christians from Egypt, Christians from Italy. And they all have chapels within different churches, and they all know each other because of that. And I think that witness, they were interested in both learning more in order for them to be able to learn more from each other. Not to change, but to learn from each other. That's there. Other questions, comments, critiques? Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Daniels, thank you so much for your work as a teacher and as a scholar of the English Reformation. I see so much possibility in your work, again, as others have done, just sort of words of affirmation. I think you've modeled, I'll mention just two ways that as a teacher I've loved your presentation. I think for one, I appreciate how I'm teaching Reformation. It's as Dr. McNutt has mentioned, there is this tendency among scholars, but also when we teach the Reformation, to divide, right? The Catholic and Protestants, and even our textbooks reflect this division. And what I appreciate is how you use the story of Ethiopian Christians to bring those two worlds into conversation. Also, as an early modern scholar who has worked in Atlantic world studies, I really appreciate how your talk also allows Ethiopian Christians to speak of their own tradition for themselves. There's such rich work being done with African Christians in the Atlantic world, but so much of that is, African Christians who have been converted, right, to Christianity, and so they are the recipients of the Christian gospel. Your work reminds us, and with Michael the Deacon and others, they are also Christians who are sharing their own work. And I wondered, just as someone who's so enthusiastic about what you brought here, I'm used as an English Reformation scholar to the tactic of reading against the grain. So I studied women in the English Reformation, and what occurred to me is how is your own work or the work of others wanting to center Michael or their own writings and kind of push back against the interpretation of Luther or Paul III, because you wonderfully showed how others are interpreting them for their own purposes. And so I would love to hear more about your own observations. How is Michael or the Clarencion positioning themselves, pushing back, saying this is what my faith is? And you showed us some examples. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, no. So Clarencion is easier to do that because there's more things that he's written. And again, I'm not sure if you put, obviously editing the New Testament, is multiple pages. But if you took his preface, I think the preface is 2 or 3 pages. But it's the startling fact that now speaking from post-colonial studies, the subaltern doesn't have writings left behind. But here's a case where writings are left behind. And then when we do often find writings left behind, it's not writing to the Pope or the famous reformer. But there's certain level to this. So the one thing that comes through is that Ethiopian Christians like Clarencion are highly disturbed by being misread as Christians. And so instead of him saying, you're the teacher, we must be wrong. No, as Michael the Deacon said, these similarities don't nullify the unity of the church. So there is a different ecclesiology that's there, and there's a different weight of how one looks at either practices or doctrine. There's some humanists who think that we can also find an appreciation for religious tolerance within the Ethiopians. And you can see some of that already from Clarencion. And so there is not only pushback, but instead of being hypercritical, how can we end up being tolerant of each other because we're sisters and brothers in Christ? So I do think as we find more, and then more gets translated from Latin to English, I think we can begin to at least take what we have and figure out what the perspective is, what the voice is. The other place we have is that there are letters that are written by some of the emperors of Ethiopia, emperors/kings, as well as one of the emperor's mother Elena or Elena. At one point, I'm hoping to put those letters together, Professor Sayon, what Luther says about Mike, and see where they resonate. So that there's even a sort of emerging Ethiopian perspective by those in Europe and by those that never left Ethiopia. And if they're echoing some similar things, that tells you something about their values. And so I think that can be done. And again, as you know, that's harder to do for some other places because there are no writings left behind. So thank you for that. On the women's issue, it looks like on the Congolese side, there are, or Atlantic African side, there are women who are Christians. I haven't at this point seen any writing. There's some portraits, paintings that are done. There's some stories that are told, especially on baptismal records. You can do a biographical sketch of who they are, where they're from, who their family might be. So you can do that part. I was mentioning in the class earlier, this Johannes Baptiste, or Johannes, it's unclear whether it's Baptiste or not, but Johannes, in order to become a Catholic bishop, you have to have a background check, we would call it. So there's an actual dossier on it that goes with the history of his family to make sure there's no heretics, that they were actually Christian when he was born, etc., etc., etc. So one could reconstruct his mother's story by using that dossier. And there's other women that are in Cyprus that one might be able to do that. So there are some things that can be done in order to go beyond a male story. And again, there are things that we not only get with the European set, but we also get, in this case, with the Ethiopian set. Any other questions? Yes?
It really struck me that Luther, at the very least, seemed to respect, if not have full Eucharistic communion with the Ethiopian church when he was so, and you said, cantankerous about doing that with anyone around him. And so I was wondering, do you think that if the field really embraces and looks more into and investigates the Ethiopian part of the Reformation and influence more, do you think that it could have really monumental effects on Christians in all traditions' understanding of ourselves and our relationships with our brothers and sisters in Christ worldwide? Because it just seems like this could have some really powerful implications if it breaks our Catholic Protestant binary.
No, I agree with you on that. But one of the things, though, going back to how we teach the Reformation, because of our fascination with sola scriptura and sola fide, we only want to say doctrine and Bible matter, and not history. And while history doesn't preempt, it looks like, as a few people have said, history is playing a role. And I think that's why he almost needs Ethiopians. Because it's like, this is my historical proof. And again, if he thinks they go back to Acts chapter 8, it's even stronger proof than the Greek church. And so there is this part that he wants to believe. I think George Postay is reading a lot into their motives and elements, but I do think that there's something there, again, when one does the contrast. And I do think that if on both sides the Ethiopians had been listened to, they would have been more amicable with each other, and which is what the Ethiopians are trying to ask. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
This is fascinating. I'm not a historian, no, I'm fascinated with history. Kind of one question segue into the next one. Because of the presence of the Ethiopians in Portugal, is there a certain kind of respect for the Ethiopians? Culturally, because in the 16th century, Portugal now is becoming a colonial power and will get involved in the slave trade, and that's what we have in Brazil. I mean, so how does that morph? Do they just separate those things, and so the respect they may have in certain circles is not impacting how they view slave trade? How does that?
No, that's a great question, and I'm not exactly sure how to reconcile it, but I'll tell you my best shot. So the first thing it looks like, the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and some other Europeans believe that nobility is nobility regardless of color. And so the letters that are there between nobles within Africa, whether it's Congo or some Gambia area, and the Portuguese, are all very warm and caring and loving and kind. And they send each other gifts. To my surprise, when the, say, King of Congo or another place sends his son to be educated, often their sons, to Europe, they actually get back home. They're not stolen on the street and sent to America as enslaved. So there is, so in a way, the way European nobles treated peasants is very similar to the way they treated Africa on the coast who weren't nobles, except maybe a little worse. So that's number one. Number two, the latest study that talked about what Lisbon was like during this time period is from the 1980s. So we're in need of a new study. But what they showed was that the majority of Africans lived in the same neighborhoods that Portuguese peasants lived in. But there were no all-black quarters. Even though there's a Jewish quarter in Venice in the 1500s, the Portuguese don't have a black quarter. They don't segregate. Almost all professions are open up to Africans, even though in the upper professions you have, I don't know, a small number of teachers, a small number of people going to university, but they do go to university. There's a famous painter within Granada at the cathedral school. There's an endowed chair that one Latino occupies who's of African descent. Some of these are European Africans, some are all African. So there's a dynamic. So the way I describe it, borrowing from some people who do slave studies, that you can have a society organized around race, or you can have society that has people of different backgrounds, but is not organized that way. So your life outcomes are not determined by your color. So that's what it looks like is what's happening. But then I was mentioning again this afternoon. There's a scholar named Chloe Ayrton, and there was a big question about where do you place African Christians within the schema of old Christian, new Christians. And old Christians, you can give them money to go to the Americas. New Christians, those who come from Jewish and Muslim family, you cannot. And matter of fact, you try to prohibit them from traveling to the Americas. In Seville, one of the councils decided that Africans were old Christians because of the fact of the history of Ethiopia and Christianity. And so therefore, they are classified, with the church of all times. So that's why, again, as I mentioned in passing earlier, I want to divide this period that sometime after 1660 is when modern racism comes. And when modern racism occurs, then we have a hierarchy of races. People's life choices are determined by their race. There's questions about who should be the governing race and who should be governed, but that's not the driving question prior to 1660. So the 16th century isn't plagued by those questions in relationship to the Africans, but it is obviously plagued by those questions in relation to the first people in the Americas. There's a total different discourse going on. Thank you all.